Rule number 1 on a strange planet. Ethan Carter liked to say, never touch anything you don't understand. The problem was that rule came to mind about 5 seconds too late. The wind howled across the copper-colored desert like a freight train tearing through open country, rattling the cracked panels of Ethan's survey rover and pushing waves of glittering sand across the rocky valley. His boots sank nearly 2 inches into the warm dust with every step as he moved away from the vehicle, scanning the scattered wreckage that littered the landscape. The crash site stretched almost a quarter-mile across the basin, pieces of alloy hull and shimmering alien metal half buried in the dunes. Ethan adjusted the strap of his medical pack and exhaled slowly. "All right, Carter," he muttered to himself. "Find survivors first, questions later." His visor displayed a temperature of 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the desert sun blazing overhead like a white furnace in the pale sky. The air smelled faintly metallic, the kind of scent that followed energy weapon discharge and damaged ship reactors. Somewhere in the distance a low hum echoed across the valley. Not thunder, not wind, something mechanical. Ethan didn't like it. He climbed over a fractured section of curved plating nearly 12 feet long and paused when his scanner chirped once. A life sign. Faint, but there. "Hello," he called out instinctively. Even though experience told him alien survivors rarely appreciated sudden human greetings. The signal pulsed again from behind a cluster of dark basalt rocks about 30 yards ahead. Ethan approached slowly, boots crunching against crystallized sand, one hand hovering near the small med tool clipped to his belt. Then he saw her. At first he thought she was part of the wreckage, some kind of ceremonial statue thrown from the destroyed ship, because nothing living should look that regal. She was enormous, easily 8 feet tall even while leaning against the stone, her armor a layered pattern of dark violet plates that shimmered in the sunlight like polished obsidian. Strands of silver hair spilled across her shoulders and down her back, catching the wind like threads of light. Ethan stopped dead in his tracks. "Well," he whispered under his breath, "that's definitely not a statue." Her head turned slowly toward him, and 2 luminous eyes the color of burning amber locked onto his visor. Even injured, the alien woman carried an undeniable presence, the kind that made Ethan instinctively straighten his shoulders like a soldier standing before a general. A long, controlled breath escaped her as she spoke in accented but clear English through a translator embedded somewhere in her armor. "Human, leave." Ethan raised both hands slightly, palms open. "Easy there," he said calmly. "I'm a medic." Only then did he notice the damage along her back where one of the armor plates had split open, exposing a deep plasma scorch that had burned through the protective layer. The edges of the wound glowed faintly, heat distortion rippling the air around it. Ethan's training kicked in immediately. Without treatment, that kind of injury would shut down vital systems in a matter of hours. He stepped closer. The alien queen's eyes narrowed. "Touch me," she warned in a low, steady voice. "And you die. Human." Ethan glanced once more at the injury, then slowly removed the small sterilization canister from his pack. "Yeah," he murmured, already kneeling beside her. "I hear that a lot." The medic kit clicked open with a soft mechanical snap as Ethan Carter set it on the warm desert stone beside him, and the sound seemed strangely loud in the endless wind sweeping across the valley. The alien queen did not move, but the air around her felt tense like the charged atmosphere before a lightning storm. Ethan could feel her eyes studying every motion he made while grains of copper-colored sand skittered across the rock beneath his knees. He carefully removed a sterile cloth pad and a small bottle of cooling antiseptic solution, the liquid inside sloshing quietly. "I am going to clean the burn," he said slowly, speaking clearly so the translator embedded in her armor could keep up. "If I do not, infection will be the least of your problems." The alien woman watched him with a calm that felt far more dangerous than anger. Her voice carried the steady authority of someone used to commanding fleets instead of arguing with stranded survey medics. "You believe you understand my biology, human?" Ethan gave a small shrug, even though she was not looking at his shoulders. "Not really," he admitted. "But damaged tissue and contamination behave pretty similar across most carbon-based life." "Lucky guess." For a moment the queen said nothing. The desert wind whistled through the broken hull fragments scattered across the valley, and somewhere far away a piece of metal shifted with a dull hollow echo. Ethan glanced at the exposed section of armor along her back again. The wound had sealed partially under the heat of the energy strike, but the surrounding plates had warped open, leaving the injury vulnerable. The surface shimmered with faint thermal distortion. His scanner projected a warning icon across the inside of his visor. Body temperature rising. Cellular stress markers high. You should be unconscious, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Your physiology must be impressive. The Queen finally spoke again, her tone cool and controlled. I am Thauron. We do not collapse easily. Ethan nodded once as if that answered everything. Good to know. He soaked the cloth with antiseptic and hesitated for half a second before reaching toward the damaged armor plate. The alien Queen's voice came again, sharper this time. Human. Ethan paused, but did not pull back. Yes. You were warned. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose, then began gently wiping the scorched surface around the wound. The antiseptic hissed faintly when it touched the heated metal and tissue beneath the broken plate. The Queen inhaled sharply, but she did not move away. Ethan worked carefully, steady hands guided by years of treating miners, pilots, and more than a few stubborn explorers who had ignored safety protocols. The silence stretched for several long seconds, broken only by the wind and the faint mechanical chirp of his med scanner. Then something unexpected happened. The alien Queen froze completely. Her posture stiffened, and the subtle tension in her shoulders shifted into something Ethan could not quite read. Human, she said again, but this time her voice carried something new beneath the authority. Not anger, not pain, something closer to disbelief. Ethan continued cleaning the edge of the wound, unaware of the cultural storm he had just stepped into. Try to stay still, he said calmly. This part might sting a little. Another long moment passed before the Queen spoke again, her golden eyes narrowing as if studying a puzzle she had never encountered before. Do you understand? She asked slowly. What it means that you are touching my back. Ethan blinked behind the visor and glanced up at her towering form. Honestly, he said, no idea. The Queen stared at him in silence as the desert wind howled across the valley, and somewhere beyond the distant ridge the faint rumble of approaching engines began to roll through the sky. The rumble in the sky grew deeper, rolling across the desert valley like distant thunder moving through metal. Ethan Carter heard it clearly this time and lifted his head, his visor automatically zooming toward the horizon. A thin line of movement shimmered in the bright white sky above the far ridge, several dark shapes cutting through the sunlight with precise formation. Aircraft. Alien aircraft. That does not sound friendly, Ethan muttered quietly. The Queen did not look toward the sky. Her glowing amber eyes remained locked on him, as if the approaching ships were far less important than the medic kneeling behind her. You still have not answered my question, human, she said. Ethan finished wiping the last trace of residue from the edge of the damaged armor plate and applied a cooling gel that spread across the scorched area with a faint silver sheen. The gel reacted instantly, lowering the heat signature around the wound and stabilizing the surrounding tissue. I thought I did answer, Ethan said. I told you I do not understand. He sealed the portable medical patch over the injury and secured it along the edge of the broken plate. There. That should prevent further damage until you reach proper medical facilities. Only then did he lean back slightly on his heels and finally meet her gaze directly. Up close, the alien Queen was even more striking than he had first realized. Her violet armor was not manufactured metal the way human equipment was. It flowed across her form in layered segments like living crystal, shifting subtly with each breath she took. Thin lines of soft blue light ran along the seams of the armor like veins of energy. Ethan had spent 5 years working as a field medic on frontier worlds, and he had seen dozens of alien species. None of them carried the same quiet gravity as the being sitting in front of him. You are remarkably calm, the Queen observed. Ethan glanced toward the sky again, where the approaching aircraft had grown slightly larger against the glare of the sun. Honestly, he said, panic has never helped anyone survive a bad day. The Queen studied him in silence for several seconds before speaking again. Human Ethan Carter, she said. Slowly, reading the name that glowed faintly on the identification strip attached to his suit. Ethan blinked. That translator reads pretty fast. You touched my back, she continued. Specifically the central plate along the dorsal crest. Ethan gave a small nod. That is usually where injuries show up when armor splits open. In Thauran culture, she said, her voice calm but unmistakably serious. That region is considered sacred. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Sacred how? The queen held his gaze. Only the bonded partner of a Thauran may place their hands there. Ethan stared at her for a full 2 seconds before looking down at the medical cloth still in his hand. Then he looked back up at her again. You are telling me, he said carefully, that cleaning your injury just broke some kind of cultural rule. The queen answered without hesitation. It did not break the rule. Her amber eyes narrowed slightly as the distant roar of engines continued to grow louder above the desert valley. It fulfilled it. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but paused when his rover's scanner suddenly chirped a rapid warning tone through his helmet. Multiple incoming signals. Fast-moving. Closing distance. Ethan slowly turned his head toward the sky again as the dark shapes above the ridge became clearly visible now. Long, narrow aircraft descending toward the valley floor in deliberate formation. Let me guess, Ethan said under his breath. Those are not rescue teams. The queen followed his gaze for the first time, and her expression hardened into something cold and regal. No, she replied quietly. They are hunters. The aircraft grew larger every second, their dark silhouettes cutting across the white desert sky like sharpened blades. Ethan Carter slowly stood up from the rock where he had been kneeling, brushing copper-colored dust from his gloves, while his visor automatically tracked the descending ships. Hunters, he repeated quietly, the words sitting heavily in the dry air. The queen did not move quickly, but there was a shift in her posture that Ethan recognized immediately from years around soldiers and security crews. It was the posture of someone who had already calculated the situation and found it unacceptable. They followed the signal from my vessel, she said. Her voice carried no panic, only controlled certainty. They will not stop searching until they confirm my fate. Ethan watched the ships descend another 1,000 feet closer to the valley floor. The engines produced a low vibrating hum that rolled through the rocks beneath his boots. That sounds like very determined company, he said. Let me guess. They are not here to offer medical assistance. The queen gave him a brief look that almost resembled dry amusement. No, they are here to make certain I never leave this planet. Ethan glanced back toward his rover parked roughly 60 yards away beside a shattered piece of alloy hull. The vehicle was small, built for 2 survey crew members and some equipment. Not exactly a military transport capable of outrunning alien aircraft. Still, it was the only option within sight. How fast can you move? He asked. The queen rose to her full height with a slow, controlled motion. Even injured, she towered over him by nearly 2 feet, her violet armor catching the sunlight as the blue lines along its seams pulsed faintly. For a moment, Ethan wondered if she would collapse once she stood, but instead she remained steady though the effort was clearly taxing. Fast enough, she replied. Ethan nodded once and gestured toward the rover. Then we should probably leave before they get curious about the local geology. The queen followed his gaze to the vehicle. You would help me escape? She asked. Ethan looked back at her as if the answer were obvious. You are a patient, he said simply. And those aircraft do not look like people interested in medical recovery. The rumble overhead grew louder now, the lead ship beginning to sweep in a slow arc across the valley as if scanning the terrain below. Dust lifted from the ground in swirling spirals as the air pressure shifted. Ethan started walking quickly toward the rover, expecting the queen to follow. After 2 steps he realized she had not moved. He turned back. She was still watching him with that same intense golden gaze. Human Ethan Carter, she said, her voice carrying the weight of something more formal now. You should understand the consequence of your earlier action. Ethan tilted his head slightly. You mean the cleaning your injury part? Yes. The aircraft above them shifted formation, and one of them descended lower, its underside reflecting sunlight like a dark mirror. The queen continued, her voice steady despite the approaching threat. Among my people, the act you performed signifies trust, deeper than most alliances. Ethan blinked once behind his visor. I thought it was just medical treatment. To you, perhaps, she said. To my civilization, it means something very different. Ethan exhaled slowly and glanced at the sky again before looking back at her. You know, he said calmly. Today is becoming a very complicated day. The queen stepped forward at last, following him toward the rover as the first aircraft passed directly overhead with a thunderous vibration that rolled across the valley floor like a storm. The rover's metal frame shimmered under the desert sun as Ethan Carter reached it and pulled open the side hatch with a sharp mechanical click while the wind continued to sweep grains of copper-colored sand across the valley floor. Behind him, the towering alien queen approached with steady, deliberate steps, her violet armor reflecting the bright light in shifting patterns like polished crystal. Overhead, the aircraft circled lower now, their engines producing a steady vibration that Ethan could feel through the soles of his boots. "All right," he said as he climbed halfway into the driver's seat and quickly activated the console. "Let us see if this old machine still believes in miracles." The dashboard flickered to life, projecting pale blue diagnostic icons across the windshield. Power cells at 62%. Drive system functional. Navigation signal weak, but stable. Ethan allowed himself a small relieved breath. "Good," he murmured. "Still alive." He glanced over his shoulder just as the queen reached the rover and paused beside it, her tall figure casting a long shadow across the vehicle. For a moment, she simply studied the machine with quiet curiosity, as if evaluating a strange animal. "This vessel is yours?" she asked. "Technically, it belongs to the survey company," Ethan replied while adjusting the control levers. "But today it belongs to anyone who does not want to get caught by those aircraft." Another ship passed overhead, slightly lower this time, its dark hull briefly blocking the sun and throwing the desert valley into a moving shadow. Dust spiraled upward from the ground in response to the powerful engines. The queen looked up at the passing craft and then back down at Ethan. "They are scanning," she said calmly. Ethan nodded once. That is usually what flying machines do when they are looking for someone. He reached across the passenger side and pressed the release latch. The door slid open with a short hiss of compressed air. "You might want to get inside." The queen lowered her head slightly to look into the small two-seat cabin. The interior was clearly not designed for someone of her height. Ethan realized this the exact moment she tried to step inside and immediately stopped. For the first time since he had met her, the queen seemed almost uncertain. "This machine was not built for Thauran physiology," she observed. Ethan leaned sideways in the seat and quickly scanned the space. "That is a polite way of saying it is very small," he said. The aircraft engines above them grew louder again as one of the ships shifted position directly over the valley. Ethan's visor flashed a warning symbol. "Active scanning field detected." "We do not have time to redesign the vehicle," Ethan said calmly. "Try sitting sideways." The queen studied the rover for another second and then carefully lowered herself into the passenger seat with controlled movements, folding her long legs and adjusting the angle of her armored shoulders until she fit within the cramped cabin. The metal frame creaked slightly, but held. Ethan nodded approvingly. "See," he said, gripping the steering controls. "Engineering is 90% improvisation." The queen turned her glowing amber eyes toward him again as the rover engine hummed to life. "Human Ethan Carter," she said quietly over the rising sound of the motor. "You are risking your life to help me." Ethan shifted the rover into drive, and the vehicle rolled forward across the desert sand, leaving a thin trail of dust behind it. Above them, the aircraft continued circling like patient predators searching the valley floor. Ethan kept his eyes on the rocky terrain ahead while he answered her. "Today seems to be full of unexpected responsibilities," he said calmly. "And apparently one of them is getting an alien queen off this planet before those hunters decide to introduce themselves." The rover bounced over a ridge of hardened sand, and Ethan Carter tightened his grip on the steering controls as the small vehicle accelerated across the open desert floor, its electric drive humming steadily beneath the rattling frame while dust streamed behind them in a pale copper trail. Above them, the aircraft continued circling the valley, their dark silhouettes drifting across the bright sky like silent birds of prey studying the ground. Below, Ethan kept his eyes forward, guiding the rover between scattered rock formations and broken fragments of alien hull that glinted in the sun. The navigation display flickered with interference from the scanning signals sweeping the area. "They are definitely looking for something," he said quietly. Beside him, the alien queen remained still, her tall frame angled carefully within the cramped cabin, one armored shoulder nearly touching the ceiling. Even in the limited space, she carried an air of composed authority, her glowing amber eyes calmly observing the shifting terrain ahead. "They are looking for me," she said. Ethan nodded once. That part one already figured out. The rover rolled down a shallow slope and onto a wide stretch of open ground where the sand shimmered under the heat. Ethan adjusted the steering slightly to keep the vehicle moving between clusters of basalt rock that could offer temporary cover from aerial scanners. "You know," he said after a moment, "most days my job involves patching up survey workers who fall off ladders or get heat exhaustion." The Queen turned her gaze toward him with mild curiosity. "And today?" Ethan allowed a faint smile. "Today apparently involves transporting alien royalty across a desert while being followed by hunters." The Queen studied him for several seconds, as if measuring the strange calm in his voice. "You speak of danger with remarkable ease." Ethan shrugged lightly. "Experience." Another aircraft passed overhead at a higher altitude, its scanning field briefly washing across the desert surface like a ripple of invisible light. Ethan lowered the rover's speed and guided it behind a large rock outcrop, nearly 15 feet tall. The vehicle settled into the shadow of the stone formation while the engines above drifted farther down the valley. Ethan exhaled slowly and loosened his grip on the steering controls. "That should hide us for a minute," he said. The Queen tilted her head slightly, examining the rock formation that shielded them from the sky. "You understand terrain well for someone without military training." Ethan glanced at her. "Who said I never worked with soldiers?" For a brief moment the Queen said nothing. Then her gaze shifted toward the medical patch along the damaged plate on her back. The cooling gel continued to glow faintly beneath the transparent seal. "Your treatment stabilized the injury," she said. "Few non-Thauran physicians would have known how to do that." Ethan leaned back slightly in his seat. "I did not know. I guessed." The Queen considered this before speaking again. "Your guess saved my life." The desert wind swept around the rock formation, carrying the distant hum of aircraft engines as they continued their search patterns across the valley. Ethan looked toward the horizon where the sky shimmered with heat and dust. "Well," he said calmly, "let us try to keep it that way." The Queen watched him quietly, and for the first time since they met the fierce authority in her expression softened into something closer to curiosity. "Human Ethan Carter," she said slowly, "you risk everything for a stranger." Ethan rested his arms on the steering wheel and glanced back at her with an easy expression. "That is the thing about humans," he replied. "Sometimes we help first and figure out the consequences later." The desert remained silent for several long seconds as the aircraft drifted farther across the valley, their engines fading into the hot, shimmering distance while the rover rested in the shadow of the towering rock formation. Ethan Carter kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other hovering near the control panel, watching the sky through the narrow gap between two jagged stone ridges. Heat waves bent the horizon into rippling distortions, and grains of copper-colored sand whispered across the rover's metal frame. "They are widening the search pattern," Ethan said quietly after studying the scanner for a moment. The display projected faint arcs of moving signals sweeping across the terrain like invisible tides. Beside him the alien Queen remained perfectly still, her tall figure composed despite the confined cabin. The soft blue lines in her armor pulsed slowly with each measured breath she took. "They will continue until they are certain I am not here," she said. Ethan gave a small thoughtful nod. "That sounds like a very thorough kind of enemy." The Queen turned her luminous eyes toward him again. "They are not my enemies alone," she replied calmly. "Anyone who aids me becomes their target." Ethan rested his arms loosely on the wheel and studied the valley outside the windshield. The copper desert stretched for miles in every direction, broken only by black stone ridges and scattered fragments of wreckage from the destroyed vessel. The sun hung high overhead, turning the landscape into a sea of blinding light and deep shadow. "Well," he said after a moment, "it is a little late to worry about that part." The Queen examined him carefully. "You accept danger with surprising ease." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "I would not call it ease. More like practicality." He tapped a finger lightly against the console. "Right now we have two options. We stay here and hope those aircraft never look behind this rock, or we move before their scanners circle back." The Queen considered this and then slowly inclined her head. "Movement creates risk. So does waiting," Ethan replied. Another faint vibration rolled across the valley as one of the distant aircraft shifted direction somewhere beyond the ridgeline. Ethan watched the scanner carefully, tracking the rotating arcs of detection fields. After a few seconds, he pointed toward a narrow canyon cutting through the desert about half a mile to the east. That formation might shield us from aerial scans, he said. If we reach the canyon walls, we can follow the terrain and stay out of direct line of sight. The Queen leaned slightly forward to examine the distant rock corridor. Even seated, she carried an imposing presence, her silver hair catching the light inside the cabin. Your instincts favor terrain concealment, she observed. Ethan gave a small shrug. My instincts favor staying alive. For a brief moment, something almost resembling amusement flickered across the Queen's expression. Then her gaze returned to the medical patch along the back plate of her armor. The treatment you provided will allow me to travel, she said quietly. However, my strength is not fully restored. Ethan nodded once. Understood. He activated the rover's drive system again, and the quiet electric motor hummed back to life beneath them. Outside, the wind lifted another swirl of dust that drifted across the rocks like a pale ghost. Ethan eased the rover forward from the shadow of the formation, guiding it slowly back into the open desert. As the vehicle began moving toward the distant canyon, the Queen spoke again, her voice thoughtful and steady. Human Ethan Carter, she said. Among my people there is a saying. Ethan kept his eyes on the terrain ahead. What does it say? The Queen watched the horizon where the canyon walls waited in the shimmering distance. Sometimes the smallest action changes the path of entire worlds. Ethan allowed a quiet breath to escape as the rover rolled across the sand. That sounds like a lot of pressure for one accidental medical procedure, he said calmly, while the desert wind carried them deeper into the valley. The rover rolled steadily across the desert floor, while the canyon walls slowly rose in the distance like enormous stone gates waiting to swallow the open valley behind them. Ethan Carter kept the vehicle moving at a careful speed, guiding it between patches of jagged basalt and shallow dunes where the sand shifted like liquid copper under the afternoon sun. The sky above remained painfully bright, the heat bending the horizon into shimmering waves that made distant objects appear to float. Behind them, the aircraft continued their slow, methodical search across the valley, their dark shapes gliding through the sky with patient precision. Ethan checked the scanner again and saw the arcs of detection sweeping the terrain farther west now. Looks like we have a few minutes before they circle back, he said quietly. Beside him, the alien Queen studied the approaching canyon with thoughtful focus. The towering stone walls stretched nearly 300 feet high, their dark surfaces carved by centuries of wind into sharp ridges and shadowed ledges. That formation will conceal us from orbital sensors, she said. Ethan nodded slightly. That is the idea. The rover crested a shallow ridge and began descending toward the canyon entrance where the sunlight dimmed as the rock walls closed in around the narrow path. The temperature inside the canyon dropped almost instantly, and the harsh wind faded into a low whisper echoing between the stone faces. Ethan allowed himself a slow breath as the vehicle passed fully into the shadow of the towering cliffs. That already feels better, he murmured. The Queen shifted slightly in the seat, adjusting her posture within the cramped space as she examined the rock formations around them. The canyon floor was uneven, scattered with ancient stones that had fallen from the walls above over countless years. Your world produces harsh landscapes, she observed. Ethan gave a small shrug while guiding the rover deeper between the cliffs. This is not my world, he said. Just another rock in the middle of nowhere that someone decided to survey. The rover's tires rolled over a patch of loose gravel, and the sound echoed softly through the canyon. Above them, a narrow ribbon of sky remained visible between the towering cliffs, but the aircraft were no longer in sight. For the first time since leaving the crash site, the constant vibration of distant engines faded completely. The silence inside the canyon felt almost unreal after the tension of the open valley. Ethan slowed the rover slightly as the path curved deeper between the stone walls. That should break their scanners for a while, he said. The Queen nodded slowly, her glowing eyes reflecting the dim blue light of the rover's control panel. You understand survival very well for someone who claims to be a simple medic. Ethan glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the path ahead. Being a medic means spending a lot of time around people who make bad decisions, he replied calmly. You learn quickly how to avoid becoming one of them. The queen studied him again, with that same quiet curiosity that had grown steadily since they met. Your species continues to surprise me. Ethan allowed a faint smile. Humans tend to do that. The canyon bent sharply to the right, and the rover followed the narrow passage into deeper shadow where the air felt cooler and the distant sky nearly disappeared above them. For a moment neither of them spoke while the quiet electric motor carried them forward. Then the queen's voice returned, thoughtful and calm. "Human Ethan Carter," she said slowly. "When my people learn what you have done today, they will see you differently." Ethan kept his eyes on the winding canyon floor. "That sounds like the kind of thing that usually comes with complicated consequences," he replied. The queen looked ahead into the dark corridor of stone stretching before them. "Yes," she said softly. "Very complicated consequences." The canyon narrowed as the rover moved deeper between the towering cliffs, the walls rising like dark stone cathedrals on either side, while the sky above shrank into a thin ribbon of pale blue light. Ethan Carter eased his foot off the accelerator and allowed the vehicle to roll slowly over the uneven ground, the electric motor humming quietly beneath the metal frame. Small stones shifted under the tires, and the sound echoed softly through the long corridor of rock. For the first time since the crash site, the desert felt distant, almost forgotten behind the silent canyon walls. Ethan glanced up at the scanner display again. The detection arcs that had once swept across the open valley now flickered weakly at the edge of the screen, distorted by the thick layers of stone surrounding them. "Looks like the canyon is doing exactly what we hoped," he said quietly. Beside him, the alien queen studied the towering cliffs with careful attention. The dim light within the canyon softened the glow of the blue lines along her armor, making them appear like faint stars beneath polished violet crystal. "Stone of this density disrupts long-range scanning," she said. "Your choice of path was wise." Ethan gave a small nod while guiding the rover around a large fallen boulder that had broken free from the canyon wall long ago. "I try to make wise decisions when people with aircraft are looking for me." The rover rolled forward another 100 yards before Ethan slowed again. Ahead of them, the canyon widened slightly into a natural basin where the ground flattened into a broad stretch of pale stone. The walls rose almost straight upward on every side, forming a sheltered chamber protected from the open sky. Ethan brought the rover to a gentle stop near the base of the cliff and powered down the drive system. The quiet that followed felt almost unreal after the long chase across the desert. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place. For several seconds neither of them spoke, while the cooling systems inside the rover ticked softly as they settled. Ethan leaned back in the seat and allowed his shoulders to relax slightly. "We should be safe here for a while," he said. The queen stepped carefully out of the rover, unfolding her tall frame as she stood beside the vehicle. The dim canyon light reflected across her armor as she lifted her gaze toward the narrow slice of sky far above them. Ethan climbed out as well, stretching his arms after the cramped drive. The air inside the canyon felt cooler, carrying the faint mineral scent of ancient stone. The queen walked a few steps away from the rover and examined the rock walls that surrounded the basin. Her movements remained steady, though Ethan could see the strain beneath her calm posture. The medical patch along the damaged armor plate continued to glow faintly beneath the seal. "You should sit down," Ethan said gently. "Your body still needs time to recover." The queen paused and looked back at him. For a moment, the commanding authority in her expression softened into something more thoughtful. She lowered herself carefully onto a broad stone ledge beside the rover. Ethan retrieved a small water container from the vehicle and placed it on the ground within her reach, even though he was not certain whether her species required it. The queen noticed the gesture immediately. "You continue to show concern," she said quietly. Ethan leaned lightly against the rover and looked up at the thin ribbon of sky above the canyon walls. "That is part of the medic job description," he replied. The queen watched him for a long moment before speaking again. "Among the Thauren," she said slowly, "acts of care carry meaning beyond simple kindness." Ethan glanced at her with mild curiosity. "You mentioned something like that earlier." The queen inclined her head slightly. "Yes. And when my people discover who placed his hands upon my crest to preserve my life, they will not see it as coincidence." Ethan crossed his arms and studied the canyon floor thoughtfully. "Something tells me that explanation is going to become important later." The queen's glowing eyes reflected the dim canyon light as she answered quietly. More important than you realize, Ethan Carter. The canyon basin remained quiet for several long minutes, the towering stone walls trapping the cool shade, while the thin ribbon of sky above slowly shifted from bright white to a softer pale blue as the sun moved across the desert beyond the cliffs. Ethan Carter stood beside the rover with one hand resting lightly on the metal frame, his eyes scanning the upper edges of the canyon where sunlight spilled across jagged ridges hundreds of feet overhead. The silence felt almost too perfect after the constant tension of the open valley. Even the faint hum of distant aircraft had faded into nothing. The alien queen remained seated on the stone ledge, her tall figure outlined by the soft blue glow running along the seams of her armor, while the medical seal along her back continued to stabilize the damaged plate. For a time neither of them spoke. Ethan used the quiet to review the rover's handheld scanner, adjusting its sensitivity to detect any signal that might slip past the natural shielding of the canyon walls. After several moments he lowered the device and exhaled slowly. If those aircraft return we'll have to fly almost directly overhead to see us, he said calmly. The queen lifted her gaze toward the narrow sky above them. They will return, she replied. Patience is one of the strengths of those who hunt. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. That is what I was afraid of. He moved a few steps across the stone floor of the basin, studying the canyon passage that continued deeper between the cliffs. The corridor twisted gradually out of sight, disappearing into shadow where the rock walls curved sharply away from the sunlight. This canyon keeps going, he said after a moment. The queen followed his gaze. Yes, these formations often stretch for many miles through the desert crust. Ethan folded his arms while considering the terrain. Which means if we stay here too long we become predictable. The queen studied him with the same calm curiosity she had shown since the beginning of their strange partnership. You continue to think several steps ahead, she observed. Ethan gave a small shrug. It is a habit that helps people survive. He glanced again at the medical patch along her armor. The cooling seal had stabilized the damaged plate, but it was clear she had not fully recovered. Even standing for extended periods would still strain her strength. How much longer until you can travel comfortably, he asked. The queen considered the question carefully before answering. My body is recovering faster than it would without your treatment, she said. However, the injury still limits my endurance. Ethan nodded slowly as he processed the situation. Then moving slowly is better than staying still. The queen rose from the stone ledge with deliberate control and stepped toward him. Even weakened, she carried the unmistakable presence of a ruler, her posture straight and composed beneath the violet armor. When she stood beside him, she turned her gaze once more toward the narrow sky, far above the canyon. Your decision to help me has already changed the course of events, she said quietly. Ethan looked at her with mild curiosity. You mentioned that earlier. Yes, she replied. And you should understand that the consequences will extend far beyond this canyon. Ethan allowed a faint, thoughtful smile. You keep saying things like that, but you have not explained why. The queen lowered her gaze slightly and studied him with quiet seriousness. Because among the Thaurin the act you performed is not only symbolic. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. Meaning? The queen held his gaze for a long moment before answering. Meaning that when my people discover what happened here, they will believe that the human who saved my life is no longer merely a stranger. Ethan crossed his arms again while considering that statement. Something tells me that conversation is going to get complicated. The queen inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging the understatement. Yes, she said softly. Very complicated. The canyon basin held its silence like an ancient secret, while Ethan Carter continued studying the narrow passage that wound deeper into the rock. The air felt cooler here, carrying the dry mineral scent of stone that had not seen direct sunlight for centuries. Somewhere high above, a faint whisper of wind slipped between the cliffs and drifted down into the basin like a distant breath. Ethan checked the scanner again and adjusted the sensitivity dial slowly. For a few seconds the screen displayed nothing but quiet static lines moving across the grid. Then a faint signal flickered along the upper edge of the display. Ethan frowned slightly. That is interesting, he murmured. The alien queen turned her glowing eyes toward the device in his hand. What do you see? Ethan rotated the scanner so she could observe the display. A thin moving line pulsed near the boundary of the canyon walls. Something just passed above the canyon rim, he explained calmly. The queen rose from the stone ledge and stepped closer, her tall figure casting a long shadow across the rover's metal frame. She studied the faint signal carefully before lifting her gaze toward the narrow sky above. They are adjusting their search, she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. Looks like they realize the canyon exists. The faint hum of distant engines slowly returned, drifting down through the thin ribbon of sky like a faraway storm approaching across the desert. It was not loud yet, but it carried a steady rhythm that suggested the aircraft were sweeping back toward their position. Ethan slipped the scanner onto his belt and leaned lightly against the rover while thinking through the situation. If they fly low enough, the canyon will not hide us anymore, he said. The queen watched the sky for several seconds before speaking. They will attempt a closer pass. Ethan allowed a slow breath to escape. Then we should keep moving. The queen studied the winding corridor that disappeared deeper into the canyon. The passage curved sharply around several towering rock formations before vanishing into shadow. Your rover can travel through that terrain? She asked. Ethan glanced at the uneven stone floor and shrugged slightly. It will not be comfortable, but it will move. Another distant vibration rolled through the canyon walls, stronger this time. Small particles of dust drifted from the upper cliffs as the sound echoed down the long corridor of stone. Ethan climbed back into the rover and activated the control panel. The console lights glowed softly against the dim canyon shadows as the electric drive system hummed awake again. If those aircraft decide to look down this canyon, I would prefer not to be sitting in the same place when they do, he said calmly. The queen stepped into the passenger seat once more, carefully adjusting her posture within the cramped space. Her glowing eyes remained focused on the narrow sky above as the engine vibrations slowly grew louder. Ethan guided the rover forward again, the tires rolling across the pale stone floor while the canyon walls swallowed the vehicle deeper into shadow. For several moments they traveled in silence, the sound of the rover's quiet motor echoing gently through the rock corridor. Then the queen spoke again, her voice thoughtful but steady. Human Ethan Carter, she said slowly. You continue to protect a ruler from a world that is not your own. Ethan kept his eyes on the winding canyon path ahead, while answering in the same calm tone he had used since the beginning of their journey. Right now you are not a ruler, he said. You are a patient who still needs help. The queen watched him with a long, steady gaze before speaking again. Your reasoning is simple, she said softly. Ethan nodded slightly. Simple usually works. Above them, the distant hum of engines grew stronger as the aircraft returned to search the desert sky. The rover continued deeper into the canyon, its quiet electric motor echoing softly between the towering stone walls, while Ethan Carter guided the vehicle along the winding corridor of pale rock. The passage grew narrower with every turn, the cliffs rising like enormous pillars that blocked almost all of the sky above. Only a thin strip of light remained overhead now, a pale ribbon that shifted slowly as the rover advanced through the shadows. Ethan kept one eye on the uneven ground and the other on the scanner mounted beside the control panel. The device flickered with faint interference from the dense stone surrounding them, but the distant hum of aircraft engines was growing louder with each passing minute. Somewhere far above the canyon rim, the hunters were still searching. They are closer than before, Ethan said quietly. Beside him, the alien queen listened to the faint vibrations rolling down the canyon walls. Her expression remained composed, but her glowing eyes carried the sharp awareness of someone who understood exactly how patient enemies could be. Yes, she replied. They are narrowing their pattern. The rover climbed over a ridge of fractured stone and entered another bend in the canyon where the walls curved inward, forming a long corridor of shadow. Ethan slowed slightly to navigate around several large boulders that had fallen from the cliffs long ago. The vehicle rolled carefully between them, its tires crunching against gravel that had not been disturbed in years. If we keep following this canyon, Ethan said, there is a chance it opens somewhere beyond the desert ridge. The queen studied the rock formations carefully. Or it may end in a dead basin, she said. Ethan nodded calmly. That is also possible. Another deep vibration rolled through the canyon, stronger this time. Dust trickled from a high ledge and drifted slowly downward like pale smoke. Ethan glanced at the scanner again and saw a stronger signal flashing briefly across the screen before fading into interference. One of them just passed almost directly overhead, he said. The Queen tilted her head slightly toward the narrow sky above the canyon walls. Even though the aircraft remained out of sight, the distant engines could now be heard clearly as they swept across the desert beyond the cliffs. They are attempting a closer search, she said. Ethan allowed a slow breath to escape and guided the rover around another sharp bend where the canyon opened slightly into a wider corridor. The ground here was smoother, almost flat compared to the jagged stone behind them. The sudden change in terrain made him pause for a moment. "That is unusual," he murmured. The Queen followed his gaze toward the canyon floor where the pale stone surface stretched forward in a long, smooth path, as if carved intentionally through the rock. "This area appears different from the natural erosion patterns," she observed. Ethan nodded slowly. "Exactly what I was thinking." He stopped the rover briefly and stepped out to examine the ground more closely. The stone beneath his boots was worn smooth in a way that suggested something had traveled this route many times long ago. When he looked back toward the Queen, his expression carried quiet realization. "This might not just be a canyon," he said thoughtfully. The Queen studied the corridor ahead where the path disappeared into deeper shadow beyond a final curve in the rock. "Then what is it?" she asked. Ethan glanced once more at the faint trail stretching through the stone passage before answering calmly. "It looks a lot like an ancient route through the desert." The distant roar of aircraft engines echoed faintly through the canyon again, as if reminding them that the hunters were still somewhere above the cliffs. The Queen looked from the path ahead to Ethan and then back toward the dark corridor waiting before them. "If this passage leads beyond the desert ridge," she said quietly, "it may be the only way we escape." Ethan climbed back into the rover and activated the controls once more. The motor hummed to life as the vehicle began rolling forward along the mysterious stone path deeper into the canyon, while the sound of searching aircraft continued to drift across the sky far above. The rover followed the smooth stone path deeper into the canyon, while the walls of dark rock rose higher around them, like the ancient gates of a forgotten fortress. Ethan Carter kept the vehicle moving at a steady pace, guiding it through the narrowing corridor, while the electric motor echoed softly between the cliffs. The path beneath the tires remained strangely, even compared to the jagged terrain they had crossed earlier, as if generations of travelers had worn the stone flat long before either of them arrived on this world. Above them, the ribbon of sky had almost disappeared entirely, leaving the canyon wrapped in a cool shadow that muffled the distant sounds of the desert. Even the faint hum of the searching aircraft had begun to fade again as the canyon twisted deeper beneath the surface of the land. Ethan glanced at the scanner mounted beside the console and noticed something that made him raise an eyebrow. The interference that had filled the screen earlier was gone. Instead, a quiet field of empty readings stretched across the display. "That is interesting," he said quietly. The alien Queen turned her glowing amber eyes toward the device. "What has changed?" Ethan adjusted the sensor range once more and studied the results. "The stone above us must be thicker here," he explained. "Their scanners cannot see this deep." The Queen looked upward toward the towering walls that curved inward like the ribs of some enormous creature frozen in stone. "Then this path truly shields us." Ethan nodded slowly. For the moment. The rover continued forward around one final bend in the canyon, and the narrow corridor suddenly opened into a wide stone passage that sloped gently downward toward a distant glow of sunlight. Ethan slowed the rover slightly as the terrain began to level out again. "Looks like this route goes all the way through the ridge," he said. The Queen studied the widening canyon with careful attention. The distant opening revealed a second desert valley beyond the mountain wall, one that stretched toward the horizon under a sky untouched by the hunters circling the original crash site. A faint breeze carried warmer air through the passage as if the canyon itself were breathing. Ethan allowed a slow breath to escape as the realization settled in. "Well," he murmured, "that might be the luckiest road I have ever found." The Queen watched the distant sunlight for several seconds before turning her gaze back toward him. For the first time since they met, the tension in her expression softened into something deeper than simple relief. "Human Ethan Carter," she said quietly. "Today you changed the fate of a queen." Ethan guided the rover toward the canyon exit, where the sunlight waited beyond the stone walls. "Honestly," he replied with a faint smile, "I was just trying to keep a patient alive." The queen regarded him with calm understanding. Among my people that act carries great meaning, she said. When the Thalren learn who saved their ruler, they will not forget your name. Ethan glanced toward the open valley beyond the canyon and shrugged lightly. Names are not very important where I come from, he said. The rover rolled out of the canyon into the wide desert beyond, leaving the shadowed passage behind them while the distant sky stretched open once more above the horizon. For a moment neither of them spoke while the wind swept across the new valley in long golden waves of sand. Then the queen looked toward him one last time and said softly, "Perhaps not on your world." Ethan kept his eyes on the open desert ahead while the rover continued forward into the sunlight. "But on mine," she finished quietly. "They will remember the human who touched the queen and refused to let her die."